Good afternoon. It's great to be with you. My name's Ed Olsworth-Peter, and my job title is the National Advisor for Pioneer Development, which really means that my role in the National Church is to help dioceses and then therefore parishes to think about pioneer training, vocation, how they might be formed, and the kind of roles that they might go into doing, as well as helping the Church of England think about their strategy for pioneer ministry. We're going to later on talk about what pioneer ministry might be. And Sarah, just be great to introduce yourself as well, just briefly, of where you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Sarah Molyneux-Hetherington. It is not a need to have a double barrel name to be a pioneer. I feel like I should just probably put that out there, but it does appear to be common today. But yeah, so I'm a lay pioneer of Ely. I'm in the kind of West Norfolk little branch of it, pioneer new community called Table, which does some kind of very playful, participative, messy kind of worship centered around a meal table.
Wonderful. So we're here with you for the next hour, and as we just heard, the theme today is Inhabiting Innovation. And really the idea of this webinar is to think a little bit about the pioneer way of thinking, but to borrow from it quite shamelessly and actually draw out some really helpful principles that we could all use wherever we are that might help us navigate these really quite challenging times that we're in. So it's not a webinar about how to be a pioneer. It's a webinar really about borrowing from the pioneer world in a way that we could all perhaps use in some way to innovate what we might need to do. So as a roadmap for what we're going to do, we're going to spend some time just reflecting on the world of lockdown. That might make your eyes roll. You think, oh, really? Do we have to keep talking about it? But just to kind of frame a bit of what we might have discovered so far and what might be helpful to hold on to. Well, then think a little bit about a kind of pioneer charism. What does it mean to be a pioneer? Then we'll explore a little bit about some shift principles of innovation, which revolve around our inward qualities and our outward being, and 5 things of each that might help us to innovate. And then hopefully if there's time, think a little bit about the mixed ecology. So how do we innovate in this new world that's emerging, where there might be different expressions of church around us in a physically gathered way and also in a digital way. The language of hybrid church is being used more and more. So hopefully some snapshots that you can take away and then do some deeper thinking with beyond this time, if that's all right. To kick off, we're going to just invite you to go into a breakout room, just 2 or 3 people, and maybe just to share, we only got 5 minutes, it's not long, just to maybe share one thing that you have learnt, either about yourself as a church member or leader, or that your church has learnt about itself since March this year, when all of this pandemic has kicked off. It can be something very positive, it might be something that could be more challenging, but whatever you're happy to share in your group. What one thing have you learned about yourself or your church in the last 6 months? You won't have to necessarily share back when we come back together. Is that all right? So 5 minutes in some breakout rooms for that. So I know that wasn't very long, but you probably cut your conversations short, but literally 1 or 2 people, anything you think, oh, I really want to share that with the rest of the group. If you want to, you don't have to. But anyone have anything was particularly insightful about what they learned so far?
The people you expected to disappear without trace aren't necessarily the people who did, and the people you thought would get the technology straight away are not necessarily the people you thought would get it. So it's been quite interesting from that point of view.
That is really interesting, isn't it? So lots of unexpected things. Yeah, thank you. One more person? Oh yeah, Jane.
Unmute myself. We were saying about people having to accept change in our church. There was an argument about a service being at 9 o'clock or 9:15, and it was a big argument, and now they're having it at 4 in the afternoon and accepting it as that's the way it is.
Yeah. So what's important to you can sometimes really become very strong or actually disappears, doesn't it? You have to reassess sometimes.
Yeah.
A very wise friend of mine, he lives in California, and we've never actually met in a physical space. We've only ever Zoom, but for the last about 3 or 4 years, we've done lots of Zoom conversations. And he would always say, people aren't afraid necessarily of change, but they're afraid of loss. And it's quite a simple phrase, but there's a lot in it if you think about it. People, if they feel they're going to lose something, it becomes really quite an important thing to talk about. But anyway, hold those thoughts, because I'm sure you're holding them all the time without probably wanting to sometimes, but it's all part of our journey, isn't it? I'm going to show you just a few slides here of some thinking and reflecting we've been doing in different parts of the National Church over the last 6 months or so. I oversee something called the National Anglican Community of Pioneers, which Sarah is also part of. And during the lockdown, the spring-summer lockdown, we met pretty much every fortnight online as a community across England as Pioneers, Church of England, and chatted about what we were seeing, what we were experiencing, and what life was like. And these 6 themes emerged in terms of what we were talking about. I'll just go through the headlines, but if you're interested, I can another time tell you more. There was a theme of curating rather than initiating all the time. So rather than just starting loads of new things and being the instigator, and that is a good thing to do, we felt it was also key to look at what is already going on in your community, what has already been started. And rather than doing something in parallel, actually, why not just join in with that thing, but as the people of God in that space. The second thing was about being is the new doing. And I think it was a recognition that we had slipped into an activist way of working quite quickly. And I think perhaps in all church life, that can be the case, can't it, without meaning to at times. But actually, it was really a season now for being more than doing. So in that sense, about accompaniment, journeying with people, creating spaces for people to have conversations, to reflect, to process, that kind of stuff, which might be different to, here's my event, do you want to come to it? The third theme was about lament. And I think that's still probably a very important theme. Again, how can we create spaces, either sacred spaces, either in our church or in our community in some way, or also notice the secular spaces, the community spaces where lament is being talked about or where it could be held. So, you know, in the queue for the fish and chip shop, or at the school gate, or in the park, or wherever you happen to be, at work, where are people lamenting? And actually, how could that be an important place to point to God and say, well, God is there in our lament, which is obviously a hard journey. The fourth was about fruitfulness and just reimagining what it is that we measure. And there's some great work going on now in the Church of England to look at that. But perhaps, you know, traditionally we've measured who comes to church on a Sunday. Maybe we need to have completely different ways of measuring things, and maybe looking at what we measure. And someone wise said, what matters, no, measure what matters, and what matters will be measured. I haven't got that quite right, but basically, if what we focus on will end up what we measure. So maybe we need to think about what we're trying to notice. A whole piece about generous participation, which we'll come back to, thinking about hybrid digital church, but just making sure everybody can take part in what we do as church, even though it's challenging, online and physically. And then some stuff on prejudice and bias, which we talked a lot about during the height of the Black Lives Matters movement that resurfaced in the summer again, and still a very important live issue of checking our own prejudice and our own unconscious bias, which could be in any space. So I don't know if any of those themes particularly resonate with you in your lockdown experience, or whether one of them you may think, oh, that could be something we need to maybe think about in a different way that could reframe what we're doing. The Church of England, Stephen Hunt, who's the national lead for mission and evangelism, has done some really interesting work looking at perceptions of the Church of England, and he will be able to tell you more on this. But again, the 5 headlines that he discovered, talking to over 50 people who are outside of the Church of England, people working in news, media, in industry, all kinds of different places. These were the 5 things that were most commonly said about their perceptions of us in the Church of England. There was a sense of benign indifference in the fact that actually we're not the centre of the universe in terms of the Church of England. God is clearly, but in terms of people's awareness, it's pretty minimal. They're indifferent. There was a sense that it feels very mysterious, and maybe people don't understand what we do and why we do it. I think in a positive sense, local is more important than national. So if there's great sort of national initiatives about things, actually people will notice more what's happened in their local context than those sorts of things. So For example, if your friend got married and the vicar of the wedding did a brilliant job, and actually you really noticed that, and it was really wonderful for your friend, you'll notice more about church that way than a great sort of edict from the national church. The fourth thing was that actually it's viewed positively. People, I think, are not as opposed to the Church of England as we might think they are, which is a really good thing. And lastly, really interestingly, a lot of people felt that we were embarrassed about God. And I think a few people felt that the church had swapped its belief in God for social justice. And I think one or two people in the consultation said, oh, you don't really do the God bit so much now, but you're more of a social action community or project, aren't you? Which is an interesting perception. So I wonder again, which of those are important as we think about inhabiting some innovation or doing things a little differently. Maybe we need to go in our own community and think, what are their perceptions of us? How could we find out? What does it mean? This is a mission map of England. I'm sure we can send the slides to you as well if you want to pick up any of this another time and watch the recording. This was Dave Mayle and Chris Russell, who again both work for National Church, put this together last year, looking at the data that they had, and basically making the point that there's a very thin slice of England. This is just looking at England, that are core Anglicans, only 0.36%. The tiniest slither you can see is about 12 o'clock. The orangey slice next to it would be regular worshippers, so those who come regularly but not all the time. And then just to point out the red pie, the cultural fringe, so those who connect through life events, perhaps through cathedrals, through our community events. So in London, when I was a vicar in London, we used to run an amazing community pantomime. That was our biggest thing of the year. We'd get maybe nearly 2,000 people by the time I left, actually. But they were all fringe people, all people who acknowledged the church was there, but just came to those kinds of things. And that's often where we put our missional thinking, I think. But that is the chunk that's shrinking the fastest and at the greatest amounts. Whereas if you move around to the dismissive, the sort of purpley grey colour there, that's the pie that is growing the most and the fastest. So again, there's something we might have to rethink in terms of how we connect beyond ourselves if we're wanting to do things slightly differently. And just to hold, as we talk some more, these are some lockdown questions that we put together again in the spring. I think they're probably still very applicable. And again, take a screenshot or watch the recording, or we can send them to you to ponder. So some observation questions to ask yourselves. Before lockdown, what was essential? What would you have said was really, really key and important and you would never want to give up? During this continuing period of locking down in various measures, what have we done without, or what are we doing without, and what does that mean? How are we doing? And also then during this lockdown period, what are we discovering, and what have we discovered so far? And they might just begin to tell you something of how you've adapted and changed out of necessity often, isn't it? That could lead us to some action questions, which then will, looking at our life before lockdown, thinking about what will we or won't we resume after lockdown. And kind of in the summer, we had that sort of releasing in a way where we reopened our buildings, didn't we? That was quite key. That I think quite a lot of people felt they wanted to open their building and others didn't. And that's really important to notice and why. And then in terms of kind of life now, I guess, and then eventually, who knows, when the restrictions are finally gone, we don't know when that is, but what will we do and what won't we continue to do once restrictions are lifted? So as an example, I would guess a lot of people will probably have some kind of digital presence that remains, but they may not do Zoom calls every single day of the week. It's just really, really exhausting. And there are pluses and minuses to that. And then what will be done just in a new way? What brand new thing might we decide to innovate? There's lots and lots of questions in one go there, but again, do jot them down or take a screenshot, and they might be useful to journey with your own church communities, as well as other questions. But the really important thing is the action questions are sort of holding you to what you might notice in the observation questions. So it stops it just becoming a pondering or a musing, as in a musing, and something that actually you might put into action, which is really, really key, isn't it? Okay, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's just going to explain a little bit about who pioneers are, what they do, and just tell us a little bit of her story to frame some of this. Over to you, Sarah.
Ed, could you put up the slide which has the circles? That would be really helpful. Thanks, guys. It will mean that you don't get to see each other. I'm sorry. Whenever we share a screen, it means you don't get to see each other. So to give you a bit of context, in my role, I'm looking really at that big slice of the pie, which are people who were indifferent rather than the fringe. And that's the one, as Ed said, is growing bigger. So that gives you a bit of context as to what I'm doing. So this is what we call the fresh expression journey. It might be familiar to you. And there'll be loads of overlap with what you already do. You'll already be doing lots of this, so please don't think that I'm trying to teach you how to do this. I'm just trying to share. So when I moved to Downham Market, I was brand new in the area. I'd moved from Devon, so it's a long way away. And I was doing work, what we sometimes call as a direct diocesan drop, which means it's not linked in with any parish, and developing a BMO, Bishop's Mission Order, that covers several parishes that form the town. So it's very different context potentially to what you guys are exploring. But the first thing I did was listen. I listened to anyone and everyone I could. I categorized my listening into kind of three groups. One was the churches that were already in the area, to ask them what they felt God had put on their heart, how they had been praying for this town, the way that they felt that they were meeting those needs, and what, if anything, was going amiss, which is a really lovely ecumenical piece of work to do. If you're involved with churches together, I really recommend you do that denominationally. It creates some really rich insights into our town and our areas. I also listened to people who had a faith but weren't going to church in the area. They were driving or just doing things on their own, to understand from them where they felt the church was really present and really strong, and where they felt the reason why they weren't going anywhere. Again, it was a really rich set of listening that helped me to explore different perspectives. And the last was the community as a whole, by just becoming a trustee, becoming volunteers, all that sort of stuff. Went to work in a volunteer in a charity shop, just trying to listen. Andrew Francis, in one of his books, said that he took a bunch of, when he moved to a new church, he took a bunch of his church wardens equivalent down to the local shopkeeper 500 metres down the road, so that they could hear the shopkeeper say he didn't know where the church was. It was a really tough experience, but I think it's sometimes helpful to go out and just talk to people. Obviously, I realise that is much harder right now. You know, they don't really want you hanging around in the shops. I've only got some people coming in and out. But joining the local Facebook groups that can be very taxing can also be really insightful. My listening had to turn into love. I love Downham Market with all my heart. I think it's an incredible place. And as I'm sure you guys love your communities. One really important thing for me was making sure that my love wasn't born out of a desire to fix the place. If I only loved my husband because I wanted to fix him, our marriage would not be very comfortable. And we can sometimes love our towns because of what we want to do to them, not with them or from them. And it's really important, I think, that listening means that your loving is holistic, rather than just seeing them as something to do to. That loving formed into a community. So that was with a group of people, predominantly people who had had a faith at some point, but who didn't now, or who didn't go to any church now, and forming a community with them. That's quite common. I have created church communities where the leadership team hasn't all been Christians. It's been people who are Christian, and that's really interesting and really fun. But it is less common because not everyone wants to give up so much time, and it does take time. Yeah, and it's about, and for that community, for us and for you guys, it's thinking about whether that community that might form, whether your buildings are the right place for them to be meeting. Or whether you need to, our buildings are wonderful resources, and sometimes they're absolutely the right place, but sometimes there's a real need for those to be outside. So ours at the time, it was home-based because we could do home-based. I recognise that's not possible now, but there are some really interesting projects of people doing things, remaining within the guidance, but forming these communities. In these communities, you just naturally start to share Jesus, or at least it should be natural. It's not always easy. We shared meals and stories before we shared Jesus. So for us, it was very food-based. And again, I realised that's not always the easiest thing to do with lockdown, but we've been doing, had some success with safari suppers. So doing it as drop-offs to people's houses. We've obviously done our risk assessments on that. But that's been a really nice way of sharing food as a disparate community. There's also been some really nice projects where people go out at the same time every day and meet their neighbours, and that for me was a really rich source of my community, and a lovely little community came out of there. In that sharing, in that natural place, I start to share stories, really natural to the conversation, about whatever, but usually a Jesus story, usually a God story. And in that stories, everyone's opinion and view has merit. And we start to hear different people's perspectives on this Jesus story, on what they think. Now, they might not call it a Jesus story. They may say it's the universe, or all sorts of different language, but we're sharing our experiences of God together. That community formed, coalesced a lot of the time into a church. Just one day I suddenly turned up and was like, this is church, I should take my shoes off, this is a holy place. It's not always an easy, clear, defined thing. Now I'm working on an SDF project, which do tend to want slightly more clearly defined things, but sometimes you just turn up and it's church. One thing to say is that that journey doesn't always end in church. Sometimes that project is a mission initiative, and it always remains a mission initiative of the parish, and that's a good thing too. The goal should not be to make everything into a fresh expression. That's not the measure of success necessarily. So I hope that's been a little bit helpful, and then we try to repeat that process. I hope that's been a little bit helpful. I hope it's not too disparate from your experience. But if you have any questions on that journey, how we got there, what we're doing during lockdown, overlaps with parish ministry, please just pop them the question in the chat box and I'll answer them as I go along.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. No, really good to hear your story, and great to explore that journey. And like I was saying, that can be expressed in different ways, and sometimes in a different order, but generally listening first, isn't it? And church forms at the end. But I think we know from looking at the fresh expressions that have been started and the people who are pioneering things, certainly in the Church of England, 3/4 are doing that out of a parish base, what's called parish-based pioneers. So they're doing their traditional parish church, and then also noticing there's a whole chunk of people who we just think are never going to come to what we do as it is. So let's also do something else. It's church in its own right, like Sarah was describing, but it's held together. All of it becomes part of what the parish does. It's not necessarily a separate thing, whereas other pioneers might actually not be connected to the parish system, and they're doing their thing in a space still part of the Church of England, but in a fresh start, different space. So as Sarah said, you can apply it in different ways.
And on that question of like who is pioneers, I reflect a bit on Mark's comment earlier about the people that we thought might drop off didn't, the people who stay might, all that sort of stuff. Identifying pioneers or people who are pioneering is a really interesting question. A lot of the time, there are people who are there can be people who are a little fringe in the church, where they're there, but their heart is on something else. And then maybe they're really part of their running group or their cycling group, or they're really into their nature and all those sort of things. And so it can be that you release those people to go bring Jesus and go do church in a way that is contextually appropriate to the context that they're serving in. And so another way I say is, have you got someone in your church who is really annoying, who keeps messaging you with, I want to do this and I want to do that, and you kind of keep just being like, leave me alone. It will always catch you when you need the toilet. Those people, when they are utilised and released, can do the most amazing projects, but their heart and their passion perhaps isn't going to be in improving the offer and reaching the fringe people in your church. Their real potential is probably going to be found in reaching a whole new group of people that you don't currently know as a church. And when we try to kind of force those people to try and support and revitalise business as usual, whatever that means in COVID, usually it's a bad fit, and both parties are going to get frustrated. So I saw a few knowing smiles. You might have someone like that in your community. Yeah, I'll pass back to Ed.
Thank you, thank you. And there's a question in the chat there about how do we know fresh expressions, if they're way out there, might be part of the Church of England. It's a really good question. I want to hold that and towards the end when we get to talking about mixed ecology, because that might answer your question. That's a very, very good question. Thank you. We're going to move on and just think about inhabiting innovation. As we do that, we're slightly behind time. So just a quick shout out as we are as one group, thinking about trying to think back, how did you learn to ride a bike, if you ride a bike, if you learned, or have you ever taught anybody to ride a bike? And what do you think are the best conditions that you would need in order to learn to ride a bike, if either on your own or somebody helping you? What do you need? What's helpful in learning to ride a bike? You can just unmute if you've got a suggestion, because there's not too many.
Have a bike.
Have a bike. That's pretty key. Yeah. Good suggestion.
Encouragement.
Encouragement. Yep.
You need somewhere you can have a soft landing.
Yes. Very important. Thank you.
Lack of distraction.
A distraction.
Oh, lack of distraction.
Oh, lack of distraction. Yes. Yeah. Yes. That could go
And
wrong.
don't use training wheels. If you're a
Yes.
child.
Don't use training wheels.
Get on and balance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Transformed teaching children to ride bikes. Totally.
Definitely. I absolutely agree. Very good answer. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
You need someone who knows how to do it.
Yes, you do. Very good. Any more?
You need persistence. You've got to stick at it. It doesn't just happen in the first 5 minutes. You've got to keep trying.
Yeah, definitely. 1 or 2 more final thoughts? Some very good answers.
Not be frightened of falling off.
Yeah, absolutely. Which goes back to the soft landing. That's, yeah, those two things go together probably, don't they?
Yeah.
1 more thought? You've got a great list there.
I think you need to have confidence in the person that's teaching you as well. You need to trust that they do really know what they're doing and can communicate it to you.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. The reason I was asking you that question is during, again, the lockdown in so March, April time, my eldest son, he's now 6, wanted to learn to ride his bike. And as I was teaching him to do it, I was thinking, oh, this is a really interesting analogy for how we might, in church, maybe do different things, how we might step out into innovation. And I'll just show you, it's a bit of a long story, but you don't need to know all the details for now. But here are 5 things I think, I'm sure there are more, but these seem quite important to me, that you need, oh, sorry, 1 second, that you here we go. That might be important for learning to ride a bike. You've got all of these, I think. So you need someone who's experienced, but not necessarily an expert. You just need someone who knows how to ride a bike. You need to remove the stabilizers, as someone said. My son wanted to keep 1 stabilizer on, and it took me a while to convince him actually it was even more dangerous to leave 1 stabilizer on than to take both of them off. You need to be able to take risks in a safe space. Get up close and personal. If you're the person teaching, you can't do it from the other end of the field. If you're in a field, you need to be right there holding the saddle and helping them. And it takes time and trust. I think, Jane, you mentioned persistence, which is really important. So well done, you're expert theological reflectors on bike riding, clearly. But these 5 things actually translate really well into a set of 5 qualities and practices that could be shift principles or change principles that might help us get into a more innovative mindset in our mission and our ministry. So here they are. If you imagine, say, an apple tree, you've got the fruit and the branches above the ground and the soil and the branches below the ground. So fruit and practices in the outward space, qualities and perhaps spirituality in the inward space. And looking at the pioneer criteria, which we have in the Church of England, that we use to assess someone's pioneer shape or qualities, we've boiled it down to 5 key practices that are accompanied by these 5 qualities. So they kind of work in pairs. So listen and discerning might fit together, adapt, self-sacrificing fit together. I'll just go through the practices because they're probably more relevant for now. So Sarah already talked about listening in those 3 different ways that she was describing, which is really key. Being able to adapt is really important. Being able to sort of swivel and pivot. So you might be rooted, but you're able to shift what you may or may not be doing, depending on what's best for what you're trying to do. And I know Johnny Baker, who does a lot of writing in the pioneer world, he's at CMS, talks about our missional sweet tooth, or our ministry sweet tooth. Do we have something that we naturally always go to because that's kind of our favorite thing to do? And that may be totally fine, but sometimes that may not be the best thing for growing the kingdom of God where we are. Maybe we need to do something else that's less palatable to start with for us. Maybe it's out of our comfort zone. Experimentation is really important, and that comes out in our bike thinking of actually being willing to take a risk, to do something different, and to not block what that is. If you think about people playing jazz or any sort of music improvisation, it's all about going with it and not being so rooted to your idea that you can't join in with everybody else. It would just be a disaster if we all improvised in your individual spaces, wouldn't it? You have to go and listen and go with what's happening. And not failing, but things going wrong is a very important part of experimenting. That's how we learn. And so if you've got that comfortable space or that protected space to experiment in, I think that makes it easier. There's something very important about co-creating. So it's more than collaboration. So ideally, it's great to do this kind of stuff with other people, even just one or two others. But there's actually, as Sarah said, something very important for pioneers particularly, but I think for all of us, to see who can we co-create with, and not just the people in our churches. I think it's valuable to co-create with people in our community, and maybe the people that we're trying to connect with in the first place. There might be certain things you feel actually would need to wait until they were on some kind of spiritual journey, but there's a load of really practical things that you can co-create with people. And in that sense, there's something interesting about mission and discipleship sort of blurring together. I've been ordained for about 15 years now, and in fact I was ordained in Guildford Cathedral, and I think when we were taught, still it was that idea that you might sort of do some mission and then help people to disciple and live that out in a deeper way. Whereas now I think that it doesn't work like that anymore. I think something that may feel like mission could also be part of someone's discipleship journey, and vice versa. So doing it together in the spaces that we're trying to connect is really key. And then, as Jane, you said brilliantly, persist is really, really key. Resilience, keeping going when it's tough, seeing the long game. So how could those 5 practices make a difference to where you are? You might think, yeah, we're going to do something that really is what we might call pioneering or a fresh expression. Or you might not. You might think, no, we're going to do what we do, but we're going to use these 5 principles to think about how we can perhaps reshape that, or how it can tell us more about the next stage of our journey as a church community and what God is calling us to do in our own tradition and in our own place. Underneath that then are the inward qualities, which are fairly self-explanatory and are not in any way exclusive to people who want to innovate things, but they are really important if you're wanting, I think, to live out those outward practices, which are perhaps slightly different to what we might traditionally do in our church communities in some ways. I just want to pick out one, which is this quality of being playful, which is something that I have only heard recently as a quality. Someone called Tina Hodgett, who is in Bath and Wells. She's the diocesan lead for mission and pioneering there. She's doing some really interesting work on being playful and how that attitude and quality could help us to grow in our life as a church. And one interesting thing she said to me yesterday, in fact, was that actually having a time of play, if you think about it, is an adult construct. We say to children perhaps, it's playtime now, whereas actually children will be continually in a state of play often. Learning often can be done in a playful way. All kinds of things can be done in a playful way.
Just adding on to that, in my community, the thing that released people to lead and to get involved and to contribute was play. So we have 3 values, one of which is that everyone gets to play. And when we started to frame what we were doing within the concept of play, people felt enabled to get involved, to join in, to have a go, because we inhabited a culture of we're playing together. And in play, there isn't that embarrassing, it's all gone wrong feeling. It's we're having a go at this and we'll have a go at this, and it's all a game. Not to diminish or dismiss the very serious nature of what we're sometimes discussing, but the methodology and the way we encapsulated in play really enabled, especially with 50% under 16, really, especially for them, but for the adults as well, to be honest, allowed them to step out of their comfort zone and have a go.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And the other helpful thing building on that is that often play doesn't have a particular destination in mind or a particular goal or answer. It's the play is the journey, and out of that comes something that might then exist into the future. So how could those practices and qualities help you to innovate something new or innovate just in what you're already doing? And then there's just something about how we do it, the inhabiting bit of it. And we've been thinking about potatoes versus apples, in the sense that potatoes, actually, the produce is under the soil. And if the under the soil bit represents our inward space, there's something quite interesting and a bit paradoxical about the sort of inwards contemplative place is also the functional place in a potato. It does have flowers and it does have fruit above the ground, but actually they're poisonous, so not a good idea to eat those. Whereas sometimes I wonder in our ministries, we might think about, you know, the things above the surface in the doing space, which again can be a little bit activist. So building on the idea of perhaps being is the new doing, there is another challenge there to be a bit more potato. We can be apple and potato, but think about how could what we do come from a state of being as well as a place of doing. So what does inward doing look like? Maybe inward doing is really actively embedding those 5 principles, those 5 practices I was just talking about: listening, adapting, experimenting, but really being conscious of them in our lives. Maybe an outward being is about, again, that sense of journeying, accompaniment, conversation, incarnational presence in our communities, as well as events and services and things you can come to and courses to do, that kind of thing. And as the French word for potato, as you will know, I'm sure, is apple of the earth, pomme de terre, there's something about being a bit more pomme de terre, a bit more apple. So I guess that challenge out of that is to see where is all your ministry and activity above the ground, and where is it also, or could it be below the ground? And maybe in this pandemic world, we need to be a bit more below the ground, which ties into those themes of lament and being and doing and curating as well as initiating. I just think it might speak to us. As a very quick aside, I put a just thing on social media saying I was going to be talking to you today and exploring the question, how can we be more potato? And it's opened up this amazing conversation about what that could mean. Some people saying, oh, is it about flourishing underground and only emerging when ready, needing a bit of digging to be found? Someone else said, is it staple but versatile? Somebody else said, has it got loads of eyes? And then someone else said, oh, big potato is watching you. And then it gets a bit silly, so it's a bit less helpful for us. But how are we apple, how are we potato, really, is to recap. We've only got 10 minutes left. So I want to just do a little bit of finishing up by thinking about the mixed ecology, but just for a couple of minutes, are there any particular questions or points of clarification from thinking about those qualities and practices?
I sort of think it's a shame almost that those are the qualities for a pioneer minister. You know, that these are sort of qualities that are seen to be important in pioneering rather than in just normal everyday church life.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I would argue, I think they should be for everybody. I think they should be for everyday church life, which is partly why we haven't entitled this pioneering. It's different language of innovating, which maybe feels more inclusive. The only difference I would say to, traditional parish life is that I guess the pioneers will be starting new forms of church that are away from the original worshipping community, even if it's in a different building or even in the same building, but it's not doing an invitational journey. It's saying, we're going to start something new with you, co-creating it, and we'll form church together, rather than we're already here, do you want to come to what we're already doing? Neither are right or wrong, it's just slightly different. But the qualities, yes, I agree. I think we should all be inhabiting those.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is, I mean, what you're saying there about doing church with people mean, the Anglican Church is the one church that really owns the idea of being the parish church. So we're not the church for the gathered community, we're the church for the whole parish. So why aren't we doing church the way the parish needs it? Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah. No, and
Why
I think
part of our DNA.
I absolutely agree. I think, yeah, church, if parish is there, isn't it a Christian presence in every place and for every person? I have misquoted that badly, but that's the Church of England's parish system, isn't it? So no, I agree. I think we should be there doing church, forming church, leading church for people as they need it in our parishes. I think what I'm saying is sometimes that may well be what we already have, and that's brilliant, and let's grow that. At other times, actually what we're already doing just might not be right for a certain chunk of our parish or part of our population. So rather than trying to reinvent what we already have, perhaps we also need to form something that's a little bit different, still part of the work of the parish, but it's going to be formed in a different way that's going to be more relatable to people. Not that it's in competition, but that it's just offering something else as well as. Is that helpful?
I think that those qualities, just to add on to that, are ones that as you say, they're useful for everybody. It's interesting saying, it's really easy to fall into a kind of pioneers over here and everyone else over here, and obviously that's not helpful, but it's so human to do that. Well, actually there's so much really rich cross learning that should be happening, and that goes both ways. And so hopefully some of the things we've offered, we're not offering them as these are the secret special pioneer things that we do. Sorry, that's my dog. But instead, here are things that we can do, learn from each other.
We're going to talk about mixed ecology in a second, which might also answer some of your question there. That's a very good question. Thank you. Maybe just one more question if there is one. No? Okay, we'll move on. So just to finish off then, thinking about mixed ecology, which I think is going to be a really, really important theme for the future. Sorry, one second. Yeah, so if you, we'll just go to this here. If you just imagine, so two axes, the horizontal axis, attractional and contextual. And again, I don't think this is a binary, you have to be one end or the other. It's a whole sliding scale. So you might find yourself at any point along that axis. You could be right in the middle or towards more one end than the other. So an attractional axis perhaps is more about having a host culture, that worship's already there. It's about exaltation and invitation. And in a contextual approach, it's more of a guest-led culture. It's about that circle fresh expression journey that Sarah talked about earlier. So serving first might be the beginning of what starts, and it's about incarnation that leads to exploration. And I think those are quite different approaches. They're not right or wrong, but they are doing quite different things. However, there is a sliding scale. So there might be people who are doing a little bit of both, a sort of a hybrid of those things. On the other axis is legacy and founding. So hopefully fairly self-explanatory. Legacy meaning there's already something there to build on. There's an established presence of worship and mission in some way, sometimes for centuries. And then founding is the opposite of that, where that isn't there. So there's a new presence of worship and mission. So for example, an area of new housing is quite a good example where maybe there's a church plant that is planted or a fresh expression that is started. It's obviously has been part of someone's parish and may still be, but in terms of a physical community, there hasn't been anyone there before. It's been fields, for example, and it's been built on. So that would be a founding space. So if you put these two axes together, generally you get these four different spheres, but you could plot anything, I think, in this ecosystem. So attractional legacy might be more of a traditional parish space. We've been talking about the founding and contextual space of the pioneer. A church plant, like a sort of HTB, new wine style expression of church, might be attractional and founding. And then the pioneer parish space, which might need rewording a bit, but is that sense of what we've been talking about as well. So someone starting a forest church or a cafe church or a messy church on a Wednesday afternoon, that is probably run by members of the existing church, but actually it's aimed at that dismissive chunk of the pie chart we looked at earlier. Or there's lots of examples of where people may have brought their child for baptism to the parish church building, to a traditional baptism service, and actually have then found their way to something that is a fresh expression or something that's different if they felt they didn't quite connect with the traditional expression of worship. Likewise, there are people who come and have their children baptized who do become part of traditional church as well. So again, it's not saying one is better than the other. So, and in that space, there's something really important about recognizing and resourcing the other. So you could have an ecosystem or a mixed ecology like this where it's just about saying, let's have lots of everything, but there's no connection. But to me, that doesn't really seem like the body. So actually, how can these different expressions of church recognize each other? There's a parity of esteem between them. And actually, how could they be part of resourcing one another in terms of ideas? It could be about money, but in terms of practical things, prayer, signposting, connecting. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we could do to resource each other. And then finally, without making your heads explode too much, just look at this slide. We're also working on what would the digital mixed ecology look like, and probably that's for another day. But I think there's a whole nother ecosystem emerging of whether you've had what approach you've had or still have. Are you live streaming? Are you uploading something to YouTube? Are you doing things on a Zoom call or on social media or whatever it might be? And how, if you imagine those two squares as pieces of bread, like a sandwich, rather than seeing them like this, how could they exist like this? They're part of the same thing. Des, it goes back to your point to think about, isn't it all parish? And I would say, yes, it is. So actually, how what you're doing in a physical space and a digital space, how does it connect together? How is it part of the whole expression of what it means to be the parish of St Mary's, for argument's sake? And where are people just coming to one thing? Where are they coming to two types of thing? And what does it mean to hold it all together in terms of church? Probably more on that another day, but just something to think about rather than seeing it in isolation. Maybe there are some important connections to make, or recognizing that actually people who maybe come to church in a digital ecology space maybe are never going to come to physically gathered church, and perhaps it's a mistake to try and assume that they will for some of them. So maybe we need to be innovative in forming new forms of church in the digital spaces. Just to go back to, I think it was Howard's point, was earlier on in the chat about how is it all part of the Church of England? I think that's what I would say. I think the Church of England wants to grow a mixed ecology where all sorts of different expressions of church are present that are part of the Anglican Church in the UK, in England anyway, in this case, isn't it? And actually, they all may look quite different, but they're all part of expressing the ministry of the Church of England. So I think that's probably how we'd want to hold it together.
I think on a slightly more prosaic note, we still have to follow the same rules. I still have to do a service book. I'm having great fun at the moment trying to find the right ink for my service book. That's a whole new world. Didn't know about that. We still have visitations and all the rest of it. And it's been, sometimes I think people think fresh expression is just like dance around and do whatever and don't have to do risk assessments and all the rest of it. On a prosaic note, there is that part of it. And what's been really interesting with the new representation rules, because yes, I find representation rules interesting, there's been a real right of responsibility, but also of advocacy, allowing fresh expressions within the Church of England to start to join that and become part of that. So we're still trying to knit these together a little bit, as we always are on the back foot. But fresh expressions within the Church of England are still governed as part of that Church of England, and therefore making sure that there's no heresy and all the rest of it is happening just like it is with safeguarding. So they can look very different, but they're still part of it, and the safeguards of the faith are still being protected.
Thank you. We're just at time, I think. So I think just to recap, we've looked at what are we learning through this lockdown experience and what's that telling us? We thought a bit about the need to think about mission and discipleship in different ways. We've explored some pioneer thinking, but also borrowed from that, thinking about how we could all innovate and inhabit that innovation in our own tradition, in our own expression of church. And then a little bit thinking, haven't we, about just briefly about mixed ecology. Where are we in the mixed ecology? Maybe we are our own mixed ecology. Perhaps you have different expressions of church in your parish already, or you might want to grow them. And I guess the last thing just to say as a summary is in terms of how we might inhabit innovation, to think again about what does it mean for you in your context? Does it mean doing something new and different? And or does it mean actually just thinking again about what you already do and seeing how you can innovate in and through that for the future as the world around us seems to continually change? So I think Rick Thorpe often says, the Bishop of Islington, to reach everyone we need everything, and I kind of like that. I think it's a very open ecology then in that sense, but I think innovation is going to be quite an important part of what we do in the future.